The steady hum of travelers filled the bustling halls of Kingston International Airport. Overhead, announcements echoed, guiding passengers to their gates as suitcase wheels trailed softly across the polished floors. Among the crowd, Nay strode with quiet confidence, her presence drawing subtle but undeniable attention. Naomi, a striking black woman in her late 30s, exuded a composed authority that turned heads without effort. Dressed in a fitted charcoal blazer over a crisp ivory blouse, she carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to leadership. Her skin, a rich shade of cocoa, reflected softly under the airport's bright lights. Her sleek, shoulder-length bob framed high cheekbones and sharp, discerning eyes that missed nothing. A simple silver necklace graced her collarbone, and a modest gold watch encircled her wrist. Timeless accessories that spoke of practicality over indulgence. In her hand, she clutched a weathered leather briefcase, its scuffed edges hinting at years of dedicated service. Each mark told a story, challenges met head-on and victories quietly earned. As Naomi made her way to Gate 32A for Flight 173, bound for a national security summit in Capital City, she glanced at her watch. Ever punctual, she had arrived early, a habit shaped by years in public service. Her gaze swept the terminal. Business professionals typing away on laptops, families juggling restless children, and vacationers hauling souvenirs from distant getaways. She settled into a seat by the window, watching planes taxi beneath the soft morning sun. The openness of the space calmed her, a rare stillness before the day's events unfolded. Naomi thrived in observation, preferring to let the world reveal itself in quiet details. She noticed a few passing glances from fellow travelers. Some were fleeting, others lingered just long enough to suggest unspoken questions. Naomi was no stranger to it, the silent inquiry that seemed to follow her into boardrooms, airports, and leadership circles. As a black woman in a high-ranking security role, scrutiny was part of the territory. Pulling out her phone, Naomi scrolled through her agenda, pausing at the event's title, Securing Tomorrow, Diversity in Leadership. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent the better part of her career proving that diversity wasn't a token gesture. It was essential. And yet, even now, her mere presence seemed to unsettle those who struggled to reconcile competence with complexion. A voice crackled over the intercom, announcing pre-boarding for first-class passengers. Naomi slipped her phone into her bag, rose smoothly, and adjusted her blazer. Her steps were measured as she approached the gate, her ticket ready in hand. As the scanner beeped, Naomi sensed a gaze lingering behind her. A man, perhaps in his mid-40s, stood a few feet away. His tailored navy suit and Bluetooth earpiece suggested a businessman, but the way his eyes narrowed on Naomi told another story. She met his stare briefly, offering a polite yet distant smile, before continuing down the jet bridge. Stepping onto the plane, she was greeted by the crisp blast of air conditioning and the soft scent of leather upholstery. First class was spacious, the seats wide and inviting, a small luxury Naomi had come to appreciate during long flights. She stored her briefcase overhead and slid into the window seat, her gaze shifting briefly to the man now seated across the aisle. His attention flicked toward her more than once, but Naomi ignored it, pulling out a folder to review her notes for the summit. As boarding continued, Naomi caught a faint murmur between the flight attendant and the captain near the front of the cabin. Every so often, their eyes flickered in her direction. She kept her face neutral, though the subtle interaction sparked a familiar unease. The cabin slowly filled, yet Naomi felt the tension shift. Her instincts, sharpened by years of navigating spaces where she wasn't expected to belong, told her something was amiss. She let out a quiet breath and focused on the documents in her lap. The flight was set to depart shortly. Unbeknownst to Naomi, the whispers at the front of the plane were only the beginning. A small spark before an unexpected confrontation would demand all the resilience she carried within her. Naomi Hayes settled into her window seat, the hum of the engines providing a soft backdrop as the cabin slowly filled. She carefully placed her worn briefcase in the overhead compartment, smoothing her blazer before sitting down. From across the aisle, the man in the navy suit, Bluetooth still perched in his ear, glanced her way once more. His gaze, though fleeting, felt deliberate. Naomi ignored him, her attention shifting to the folder in her lap, filled with notes for the upcoming security summit in Capital City. It wasn't the first time she had felt this kind of scrutiny. Airports and first-class cabins were familiar arenas where assumptions often spoke louder than words. Naomi knew the drill. She had grown accustomed to being the only black woman in the room, or in this case, the cabin. It never rattled her. She was here for business, not approval. But as she flipped through the neatly organized papers, the subtle weight of observation lingered. From the front of the cabin, Naomi caught murmurs between the flight attendant and the captain. The blonde attendant, her hair wound tight in a bun, darted quick glances in Naomi's direction. Naomi's grip tightened faintly on the folder. She didn't move, her expression unreadable, but inside she felt the prickle of something she knew all too well. Being silently questioned without cause. Outside the window, the tarmac was alive with workers guiding luggage carts and preparing the plane for departure. Naomi found comfort in their routine. There was order out there, a predictability that contrasted with the undercurrent of tension she sensed within the cabin. Her instincts weren't wrong. The whispers hadn't stopped. From the corner of her eye, Naomi noticed the same flight attendant step forward, heels tapping softly against the carpet as she made her way down the aisle. "Excuse me, ma'am." The attendant leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Naomi's eyes lifted slowly, meeting the woman's polite but carefully guarded expression. There was steel behind her calm gaze. "Is there an issue?" Naomi's voice was even, but there was no mistaking the firmness beneath it. "No, not at all. Just a routine check," the attendant replied, offering a thin smile. "Routine." Naomi doubted that. In all her years of travel, no one had ever asked to see her boarding pass after she was already seated. Still, she handed it over without protest, her movements deliberate and composed. The attendant studied the ticket longer than necessary, her brow creasing faintly as if searching for something, anything, to justify the interruption. When she finally returned it, her smile was tighter, the corners forced. "Thank you, ma'am. Enjoy your flight." Naomi accepted the pass with a slight nod, watching the woman retreat to the front of the plane. Her calm exterior never wavered, but inside her mind turned over the interaction. She felt the man across the aisle shift. His attention had returned, more blatant now. His earlier glances had evolved into something closer to inspection. Naomi could sense it without even needing to look. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone cool but unmistakably directed at him. The man blinked, caught off guard by her directness. He adjusted his tie, clearing his throat as though it would soften his words. "Oh, no," he said too quickly. "It's just, you don't see people like you flying first class very often." He chuckled, as if that somehow made it harmless. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she said nothing at first. Silence was often more powerful than confrontation. She simply arched an eyebrow, holding his gaze for just a beat too long. The slight smirk she gave was subtle, but carried weight, a silent invitation for him to rethink his words. The man shifted uncomfortably, fiddling with his phone and leaning back in his seat. Naomi let the moment settle, a small victory in letting his ignorance hang in the air. Sometimes, the best response was to let discomfort speak for itself, but the satisfaction was fleeting. Naomi knew the tension wasn't over. It rarely was. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, slicing through the uneasy silence in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Bradley Nichols speaking. Due to a minor security concern, we'll be experiencing a brief delay before takeoff. We appreciate your patience and cooperation as we resolve this matter." The words settled heavily over the passengers. Naomi Hayes immediately felt the shift. A ripple of glances edged her way, subtle but undeniable. Security concern. It was vague, broad enough to cover anything from a mechanical check to unruly behavior, but paired with the flight attendant's earlier request for her boarding pass, Naomi could sense the weight of implications settling on her shoulders. Her heart picked up, but outwardly, she remained composed. She had navigated worse. Still, no matter how many times it happened, the quiet expectation to prove herself, to justify her right to occupy this space, was a burden that never grew lighter. As Naomi sat still, the flight attendant reappeared. This time she wasn't alone. Captain Nichols followed closely behind, his broad frame cutting through the narrow aisle with ease. His uniform was crisp polished buttons reflecting the dim overhead lights. The authority he carried wasn't just from his title. Nichols seemed to revel in it. He stopped just short of Naomi's seat, clasping his hands behind his back with an air of formality. "Ma'am," Nichols began, his voice low and controlled, "I'm going to need you to step off the plane for a brief security check. Standard procedure. I'm sure you understand." Naomi slowly lifted her gaze from her lap to meet his. Her expression was unreadable, but the calm in her eyes was tempered with something sharper. "A security check," she repeated, her voice smooth and even. "May I ask what prompted this?" Nichols hesitated, a flicker of something uncomfortable crossing his face. "It's just a precaution," he replied, shifting his stance slightly. His eyes never quite met hers. "I'm sure you can appreciate the importance of these measures." Naomi's tone didn't waver. "I understand the importance of security. That's why I've already been through TSA screening. I've presented my boarding pass twice and had it verified." She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "So unless there's a specific reason for this request, I see no need to leave my seat." Her words, while measured, hung in the air like a quiet challenge. Across the cabin, passengers stirred. Newspapers were lowered, phones set aside. All eyes flicked between Naomi and the crew, unspoken tension thickening by the second. Nichols' jaw tightened. "I'm afraid I must insist," he said, the edge in his voice now sharper. "If you refuse, I'll have to involve airport security." Naomi tilted her head slightly, eyes never leaving his. "Then I suggest you do that," she replied calmly, "because I won't be leaving this plane without a valid reason." For a moment Nichols said nothing. His authority, so rarely challenged, now met the immovable wall of Naomi's quiet resolve. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers whispered among themselves, casting curious, uncertain glances between Naomi and the cockpit. Unmoved, Naomi remained still. She didn't flinch, didn't shift. Her fingertips rested lightly on the armrests, calm and composed despite the storm brewing around her. Nichols lingered, his hesitation betraying the cracks in his confidence. He stood motionless, aware that the confrontation was drawing attention he hadn't expected. "Airport security," he finally said, turning to the flight attendant behind him. His voice was quieter now, but carried enough weight to send another ripple of unease through the cabin. The attendant hesitated. "Are you sure, Captain?" Her tone, once firm, now wavered with doubt. "Yes," Nichols said, eyes narrowing slightly. "We need to resolve this immediately." With a stiff nod, the attendant disappeared down the aisle, heels clicking softly against the carpet as she made her way toward the front. Passengers fidgeted in their seats. Some leaned forward, craning their necks for a better view, while others buried themselves in phones or magazines, desperate to avoid involvement. Naomi took a slow breath, letting the moment settle around her. She had stood firm in situations like this before. The mask of protocol often hid the face of prejudice, but the fight was always the same. Exhausting, yes, but necessary. Across the aisle, the man with the Bluetooth headset shifted, eyes once again locked on her. This time his smirk had faded, replaced by something quieter. Still, he leaned slightly forward, his voice low. "You really think you can win this?" he muttered. "They're just going to keep pushing until you cave." Naomi turned her head toward him slowly, fixing him with a gaze so sharp it seemed to cut through the air between them. "I'm not here to win," she said softly, her words deliberate and clear. "I'm here to hold people accountable." The man blinked, momentarily stunned into silence, before sinking back into his seat, gaze firmly planted on his phone. Naomi's attention returned to the front of the cabin, her expression unreadable once more. She wasn't moving. The smug smirk lingered on the man's face as he leaned toward Naomi, his voice dripping with condescension. "You really think this ends well for you? They'll keep pushing until you cave." Naomi turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that seemed to freeze him mid-sentence. "I'm not here to win," she said quietly, her voice tempered steel. "I'm here to hold people accountable." The man blinked, caught off guard by the quiet force behind her words. Without another comment, he leaned back, suddenly engrossed in his phone, though Naomi doubted he was reading anything. Her focus shifted as movement near the front of the plane caught her eye. The flight attendant reappeared, accompanied this time by two uniformed airport security officers. Their steps were measured, their expressions neutral but authoritative. The taller of the two, a man with cropped dark hair and a badge clipped to his belt, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Naomi directly, "we've been informed of a security concern involving your presence on this flight. We'd like to ask you to step off the plane for further clarification." Naomi met his gaze steadily, her composure unwavering. "What specific concern?" she asked, folding her hands in her lap. "I've passed through all necessary security checks, and my boarding pass has been verified multiple times. I'd like to know what additional criteria led to this request." The officer hesitated, clearly unprepared for her directness. His eyes flicked toward Captain Nichols, who stood nearby, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "She's been uncooperative," Nichols interjected, his voice clipped. "I asked her to leave her seat for screening, and she refused. I believe her behavior warrants further review." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. Her attention shifted back to the officer. "Uncooperative behavior," she repeated, her tone even. "Refusing to comply with an unexplained and unwarranted demand is now grounds for removal?" The second officer, a woman with sharp features and a tightly wound bun, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol," she said, though her voice lacked the certainty Naomi expected. "This doesn't have to escalate. If you step off the plane, we can resolve this quickly." Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying the two officers. "Protocol," she said, testing the word as if turning it over in her mind. "I've dedicated my career to ensuring protocols are fair, lawful, and transparent. Can you honestly tell me this request meets all three of those standards?" A flicker of doubt passed between the two officers. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers shifting uncomfortably. A middle-aged woman 2 rows back leaned to whisper to the man beside her. "This doesn't feel right," Naomi overheard. "She hasn't done anything." Naomi caught the words but didn't react. Her focus remained on the officers before her. "If I leave this plane," she said, her voice firm but calm, "it won't be to satisfy baseless suspicion. It will be to ensure that those responsible for this situation are held accountable. So, unless there is a legitimate reason for my removal, I suggest you present it now." The taller officer opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps at the cabin entrance cut him off. All eyes turned to see 2 figures in dark suits entering the plane. Their presence commanded immediate attention. Naomi's lips curled into a faint smile. Her colleagues, the energy in the cabin shifted, the tension morphing into something electric and uncertain. Captain Nichols stiffened, his earlier confidence visibly faltering. The 2 figures strode down the aisle with quiet authority. The taller of the two, Agent Marcus Wells, carried himself with the same calm confidence Naomi did. His dark suit was immaculate, his badge gleaming at his waist. Beside him was Agent Lila Torres, sharp-eyed and every bit as commanding. Though shorter than Wells, her no-nonsense demeanor filled the space around her. "Miss Hayes," Agent Wells greeted, his voice slicing through the cabin. "Is there a problem here?" Naomi turned slightly in her seat, her calm expression never faltering. "That depends," she replied evenly, "on how this situation is about to be handled." The 2 officers shifted, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of the agent's presence. Captain Nichols opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. The balance of power had shifted. For the first time, it was clear that the lines had been redrawn. The murmurs among the passengers faded, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. Agent Torres's eyes swept the cabin, absorbing the scene in seconds. "Captain," Wells addressed Nichols directly, his tone polite but carrying unmistakable authority, "can you explain the nature of the security concern regarding Miss Hayes?" Nichols straightened, clearly bracing himself. "She refused to comply with my instructions," he said. "That kind of defiance raises questions. I was simply following protocol." Agent Torres's brow arched slightly. "Which protocol specifically?" she pressed. "Because I'm curious how standard procedure led to the targeting of a Homeland Security official without probable cause." Nichols faltered, the blood draining slightly from his face. Wells stepped forward. "Miss Hayes is not only a respected senior official, but she's here on government business," Wells stated. "Your handling of this situation is now under review, Captain." Nichols's jaw tightened, but no argument followed. Naomi remained seated, calm and unyielding. She wasn't leaving, and now everyone knew it. Agent Wells fixed his gaze on the taller of the two airport security officers, his tone measured but firm. "I understand there's been a security concern involving this passenger," he said, gesturing subtly toward Naomi Hayes. "Could you explain the basis for this?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting briefly toward Captain Nichols. "The pilot flagged her as uncooperative," he replied. "He requested additional screening before departure." Agent Torres's voice sliced through the growing tension. "And what specific behavior prompted this request?" Her arms were folded, her stare locking onto Captain Nichols, whose once confident posture began to unravel. Nichols cleared his throat, his face flushing. "She refused to comply when I asked her to leave her seat for screening," he said. Combined with certain observations, it raised concerns about her intentions. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Certain observations," she repeated, speaking for the first time since her colleagues arrived. Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "Would you care to elaborate on that, Captain?" Nichols hesitated. His eyes flicked to the nearby passengers, many of whom were now openly observing the exchange. "It's not about race," he said abruptly, his tone defensive. No one had suggested it was, until now. Agent Wells exchanged a glance with Torres. His jaw tightened slightly, while Torres's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. Torres turned to Naomi, her tone shifting to something formal. "Miss Hayes," she said, "would you like to respond, or shall we?" Naomi leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs with the same poise she had maintained throughout the ordeal. Her gaze rested firmly on Captain Nichols. "I think Captain Nichols's assumptions have spoken for themselves," she replied coolly. "But I'd be curious to hear how those assumptions align with established security protocols." Torres nodded and stepped forward, her presence commanding. "Captain," she said, her voice firm, "you're suggesting that this passenger, who passed through TSA screening, presented a valid boarding pass, and has shown no threatening behavior, should be removed based on your observations alone." Nichols's expression hardened as he crossed his arms over his chest, though his grip on control was slipping. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "This is my plane, and I'm responsible for its safety." "That's where you're mistaken," Wells replied, his tone sharp but controlled. "You're responsible for adhering to federal aviation guidelines, and those guidelines don't permit arbitrary decisions based on personal biases." The weight of his words hung in the air. Nichols's mouth opened slightly, as if to argue, but nothing followed. Torres shifted her attention to the flight attendant standing stiffly a few steps away, her eyes wide and her hands nervously clasped. "Were you involved in this decision?" Torres asked, her tone soft but unyielding. The woman hesitated, glancing toward Nichols before responding. I only relayed a concern from another passenger," she admitted. "The captain made the final call." Torres's brow arched slightly. "And the passenger who voiced this concern, did they specify any behavior or actions that warranted it?" The flight attendant hesitated again, visibly uncomfortable. "No," she answered quietly. "They just said they felt uncomfortable." Torres's eyes flicked back to Nichols, pinning him with a stare. "So to summarize," she said slowly, her voice carrying through the now silent cabin, "this entire situation stems from an unnamed passenger's discomfort, and your personal interpretation of that discomfort as a security risk." Across the aisle, Naomi noticed the man with the Bluetooth headset shift uncomfortably, his earlier smugness dissolving into something closer to regret. Nichols straightened, his face reddening with frustration. "I don't have to justify myself to you," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "I have the authority to make decisions for the safety of this flight." "And we," Wells replied, his voice cutting through the rising tension like a whip, "have the authority to hold you accountable for those decisions." He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. "Miss Hayes is not only a respected senior official with Homeland Security," Wells added, "but she is also a federal agent. Your actions today are not only unfounded but dangerously close to being discriminatory. That is something neither this department nor this airline will tolerate." Naomi watched the exchange, her face composed, though inside she felt a quiet flicker of satisfaction. She wasn't surprised by Nichols's defensiveness, she had encountered it before. But there was something deeply satisfying about watching it dismantle in real time, under the watchful gaze of those unwilling to let it slide. Torres took a step back, surveying the cabin as the tension continued to dissolve. "We'll be filing a formal report on this incident," she said, her voice clear enough for every passenger to hear. Agent Torres's voice carried through the cabin, calm but firm. "In the meantime, Captain Nichols, I suggest you reflect on the consequences of your actions before making similar decisions in the future." Nichols opened his mouth as if to respond, but the weight of the moment held him back. He clenched his jaw, then turned sharply on his heel, disappearing briskly toward the cockpit. His shoulders were stiff with frustration, but he said nothing more. A soft wave of applause rippled through the cabin, hesitant at first, but gradually building as passengers nodded in quiet approval toward Naomi Hayes and her colleagues. Naomi inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, but didn't smile. This wasn't a victory, it was a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. Agent Wells leaned down slightly, lowering his voice as he spoke to Naomi. "Are you all right?" Naomi's gaze remained steady. "I am," she replied. "But this isn't over." Torres, standing just a few steps away, crossed her arms as she watched Nichols retreat. "No," she agreed, her eyes narrowing. "It's just beginning." Even as Nichols vanished into the cockpit, the air in the cabin remained heavy. Passengers resumed flipping through magazines or adjusting their carry-ons, but the tension lingered like a faint storm cloud that refused to clear. Naomi sat still, composed as ever, though beneath the surface her thoughts churned in quiet reflection. She showed nothing outwardly. Years of navigating moments like this had taught her that much. Wells and Torres remained nearby, their silent presence a testament to unwavering support. The taller agent leaned in slightly again, keeping his voice low. "This isn't the first time we've handled something like this," Wells said, frustration threading through his otherwise calm tone. "It's happening more often than it should." Naomi gave a subtle nod, her gaze fixed ahead. "Common doesn't make it acceptable," she replied softly, "and it doesn't make it any less exhausting." Torres, who had been quietly observing the cabin, glanced toward the front where Nichols had disappeared. She spoke without turning her head. "Exhausting, yes," Torres murmured, "but necessary. If people like Nichols aren't challenged, this cycle keeps repeating itself." She looked at Naomi then, her eyes holding a trace of admiration. "You handled that perfectly." Naomi offered a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Torres," Naomi replied, "but I shouldn't have to handle anything. I just wanted to fly to a conference like any other passenger." Torres gave Naomi a knowing look, but didn't push further. Some truths didn't need explanation. They were simply understood. The soft hum of activity gradually filled the space again. Passengers returned to their own routines, but Naomi could feel the occasional glance in her direction. Some looked with quiet respect, others with curiosity. Across the aisle, the man with the Bluetooth headset sat stiffly, his earlier smugness replaced by something quieter. He avoided Naomi's gaze entirely, shifting awkwardly in his seat as if hoping to disappear. Naomi turned her attention back to the window. Outside, the sun hung higher in the sky, casting long streaks of golden light across the tarmac. Planes lined up in the distance, their engines humming steadily in preparation for departure. The view was familiar, she had seen it countless times. But today, it felt different. There was a quiet undercurrent of unease that stretched beyond the cabin. Naomi's mind drifted back to the morning's events. What should have been a routine flight had become yet another reminder of the quiet battles she fought daily. Battles against prejudice, against assumptions, and against the unrelenting scrutiny that came simply from occupying spaces where others felt she didn't belong. She let out a slow breath, her fingers grazing the armrest lightly. Naomi wasn't angry. Not in the way people might expect. Anger was easy, fleeting. What she felt was something deeper, heavier. The weight of knowing the fight was far from over. Not for her, and not for others who faced the same uphill climb every day. Toward the front of the cabin, Naomi noticed the flight attendant, the one who had questioned her earlier, standing near the galley. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she shifted her weight nervously. Her earlier confidence seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a lingering unease. Agent Torres noticed too. Her sharp eyes narrowed slightly as she stepped forward. "Excuse me," Torres said, her voice soft but direct. "A word?" The flight attendant's face paled slightly as she turned. "Yes, ma'am?" Torres leaned in, her tone calm but unyielding. "I want you to consider something," Torres began. "When you relayed that passenger's concern to Captain Nichols, did you stop to question the validity of the complaint, or did you assume it was justified because of who it was directed at?" The attendant's gaze dropped to the floor. I didn't think it would escalate like this," she admitted quietly. "I was just following procedure." Torres studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Following procedure is important," Torres replied carefully. "But so is critical thinking. You had an opportunity to stop this before it started. Next time, I suggest you take it." The attendant nodded stiffly, her face etched with discomfort. Torres took a step back, allowing her words to settle. Agent Torres's voice carried through the cabin, calm but firm. "In the meantime, Captain Nichols, I suggest you reflect on the consequences of your actions before making similar decisions in the future." Nichols opened his mouth as if to respond, but the weight of the moment held him back. He clenched his jaw, then turned sharply on his heel, disappearing briskly toward the cockpit. His shoulders were stiff with frustration, but he said nothing more. A soft wave of applause rippled through the cabin, hesitant at first but gradually building as passengers nodded in quiet approval toward Naomi Hayes and her colleagues. Naomi inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement but didn't smile. This wasn't a victory, it was a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. Agent Wells leaned down slightly, lowering his voice as he spoke to Naomi. "Are you all right?" Naomi's gaze remained steady. "I am," she replied, "but this isn't over." Torres, standing just a few steps away, crossed her arms as she watched Nichols retreat. "No," she agreed, her eyes narrowing, "it's just beginning." Even as Nichols vanished into the cockpit, the air in the cabin remained heavy. Passengers resumed flipping through magazines or adjusting their carry-ons, but the tension lingered like a faint storm cloud that refused to clear. Naomi sat still, composed as ever, though beneath the surface her thoughts churned in quiet reflection. She showed nothing outwardly. Years of navigating moments like this had taught her that much. Wells and Torres remained nearby, their silent presence a testament to unwavering support. The taller agent leaned in slightly again, keeping his voice low. "This isn't the first time we've handled something like this," Wells said, frustration threading through his otherwise calm tone. "It's happening more often than it should." Naomi gave a subtle nod, her gaze fixed ahead. "Common doesn't make it acceptable," she replied softly, "and it doesn't make it any less exhausting." Torres, who had been quietly observing the cabin, glanced toward the front where Nichols had disappeared. She spoke without turning her head. "Exhausting, yes," Torres murmured, "but necessary. If people like Nichols aren't challenged, this cycle keeps repeating itself." She looked at Naomi then, her eyes holding a trace of admiration. "You handled that perfectly." Naomi offered a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Torres," Naomi replied. "But I shouldn't have to handle anything. I just wanted to fly to a conference like any other passenger." Torres gave Naomi a knowing look, but didn't push further. Some truths didn't need explanation. They were simply understood. The soft hum of activity gradually filled the space again. Passengers returned to their own routines, but Naomi could feel the occasional glance in her direction. Some looked with quiet respect, others with curiosity. Across the aisle, the man with the Bluetooth headset sat stiffly, his earlier smugness replaced by something quieter. He avoided Naomi's gaze entirely, shifting awkwardly in his seat as if hoping to disappear. Naomi turned her attention back to the window. Outside, the sun hung higher in the sky, casting long streaks of golden light across the tarmac. Planes lined up in the distance, their engines humming steadily in preparation for departure. The view was familiar. She had seen it countless times, but today it felt different. There was a quiet undercurrent of unease that stretched beyond the cabin. Naomi's mind drifted back to the morning's events. What should have been a routine flight had become yet another reminder of the quiet battles she fought daily. Battles against prejudice, against assumptions, and against the unrelenting scrutiny that came simply from occupying spaces where others felt she didn't belong. She let out a slow breath, her fingers grazing the armrest lightly. Naomi wasn't angry, not in the way people might expect. Anger was easy, fleeting. What she felt was something deeper, heavier. The weight of knowing the fight was far from over. Not for her, and not for others who faced the same uphill climb every day. Toward the front of the cabin, Naomi noticed the flight attendant, the one who had questioned her earlier, standing near the galley. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she shifted her weight nervously. Her earlier confidence seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a lingering unease. Agent Taurus noticed too. Her sharp eyes narrowed slightly as she stepped forward. "Excuse me," Taurus said, her voice soft but direct. "A word?" The flight attendant's face paled slightly as she turned. "Yes, ma'am." Taurus leaned in, her tone calm but unyielding. "I want you to consider something," Taurus began. "When you relayed that passenger's concern to Captain Nichols, did you stop to question the validity of the complaint? Or did you assume it was justified because of who it was directed at?" The attendant's gaze dropped to the floor. I didn't think it would escalate like this," she admitted quietly. "I was just following procedure." Taurus studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Following procedure is important," Taurus replied carefully. "But so is critical thinking. You had an opportunity to stop this before it started. Next time, I suggest you take it." The attendant nodded stiffly, her face etched with discomfort. Taurus took a step back, allowing her words to settle. Agent Taurus's words hung between her and the flight attendant, the weight of unspoken lessons pressing down on the narrow space. The attendant's eyes flickered with guilt, but she offered no defense. Taurus stepped back, her message clear. Without another glance, she returned to Naomi Hayes' side. A few minutes later, the flight attendant reappeared, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her posture betrayed hesitation, and when she finally spoke, her voice wavered. "Miss Hayes," she began carefully, "I just wanted to apologize for how things unfolded. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Naomi looked up slowly, meeting the woman's gaze with a calm, unreadable expression. She let the silence stretch, observing the subtle tremor in the attendant's hands. "Apologies are a start," Naomi said, her voice measured. "But they only matter if they lead to change. Will this change how you handle situations like this in the future?" The directness of the question caught the attendant off guard. She blinked, struggling for words. I'll do my best," the woman replied softly. Naomi nodded, her expression softening just slightly. "That's all anyone can ask for." "Thank you." The flight attendant nodded quickly and retreated down the aisle, her shoulders visibly lighter, but her steps unsure. The cabin settled once more as the minutes ticked by. The crew moved with renewed focus, quietly preparing for the delayed takeoff. Captain Nichols remained absent from the intercom, leaving the first officer to handle announcements. Agent Wells glanced at his watch and then toward Naomi. "Looks like things are finally moving," he said in a low voice. Naomi gave a small nod but said nothing. Her gaze lingered on the tarmac outside, watching the sun rise higher over the horizon. She didn't need words to convey the quiet resolve that now anchored her. This particular battle might have ended, but the larger fight was far from over. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, Naomi closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a rare moment of reprieve. She hadn't just stood her ground for herself. She had stood for those who faced the same quiet struggles every day. And as the plane lifted into the morning sky, she felt that quiet but unshakable determination settle deeper within her. This wasn't just her story. It was a reminder that justice required vigilance and courage, and that change, however slow, was always possible. Naomi Hayes was ready for the call, whenever it came. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane ascended, a steady rhythm that many passengers found soothing. But for Naomi, it served as a reminder of how close she had come to being unjustly removed from the flight. The world below shrank, a patchwork of buildings and winding roads stretching toward the horizon. Naomi exhaled quietly, leaning back in her seat, her thoughts circling but her face remaining serene. Around her, passengers had settled into their routines, flipping through magazines, tapping away at laptops, or tilting their heads back for short naps. Yet, from time to time, Naomi felt the weight of lingering glances. It was something she had grown accustomed to, the paradox of being both highly visible and invisible at the same time. but one glance lingered longer than the others. From across the aisle, the man with the Bluetooth headset, the same one who had taunted her earlier, was staring openly. His eyes no longer held arrogance. Instead, they reflected something more complex: curiosity, unease. Naomi didn't acknowledge him at first, but as the silence stretched, she turned her head slightly, raising an eyebrow in quiet challenge. "Is there something you'd like to say?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The man shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming the edge of his tray table. I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier," he muttered. "It's just, you don't see people like you in first class very often." Naomi tilted her head, her gaze sharpening. "People like me," she repeated, her voice deliberate and slow. The man flushed, gripping the armrest as if bracing himself. "I just meant, you're obviously accomplished. I didn't realize." His voice trailed off, discomfort growing in the heavy pause that followed. "Didn't realize what?" Naomi pressed, her eyes never leaving his. "That you were with Homeland Security," he finished weakly, as though the words somehow explained everything. Naomi let the silence linger, allowing him to feel the weight of it. "You didn't need to know my profession to treat me with basic respect," she said quietly. "That's something I'd hope we can all extend to one another, regardless of titles or assumptions." The man lowered his gaze, chastened. He mumbled a barely audible, "You're right." Satisfied, Naomi turned her attention back to the window. She had no interest in prolonging his discomfort. Some lessons, she believed, were best left to simmer in silence. A short while later, the flight attendant from earlier approached Naomi Hayes's row. Her face was still pale from the confrontation. She carried a tray with both hands, the glass of sparkling water trembling slightly as she placed it on Naomi's table, alongside a small dish of mixed nuts. "I thought you might like this," the attendant said softly, her voice hesitant. Naomi glanced at the offering and then at the woman, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," Naomi replied simply. Her tone neither cold nor warm. The attendant lingered, shifting nervously. After a brief hesitation, she spoke again. "I really am sorry for what happened. I should have handled it differently." Naomi studied the woman carefully, noting the way her hands trembled slightly and the faint quiver in her voice. The sincerity was there, but Naomi knew better than to let apologies stand alone. "I appreciate your apology," Naomi said finally, her voice measured. "But remember, actions carry weight. What you choose to do next time will matter far more than words." The attendant nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of shame and quiet determination. "I understand," she said, stepping back and retreating down the aisle. As the flight progressed, Naomi returned to her notes. The hum of the engines faded into the background as she flipped through her conference agenda, her focus shifting back to the tasks that awaited her in Capital City. She was deep in thought when a soft voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, Miss Hayes." Naomi glanced up to see a young woman standing in the aisle. She was dressed casually in a pale yellow sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. There was an earnestness to her expression, admiration and uncertainty mingled in her eyes. "Yes." Naomi closed her folder, offering the woman her full attention. "I don't mean to bother you," the woman said, nervously twisting the strap of her bag. "But I couldn't help overhearing what happened earlier. I just wanted to thank you for standing your ground." Naomi's brow furrowed slightly in surprise. "Thank you," she replied gently. "But may I ask why it struck you?" The woman smiled nervously. "I'm a law student," she admitted. "I've been reading a lot about discrimination cases and how people in leadership respond to them. Seeing you, it reminded me why I chose this path. People like you inspire people like me." Naomi felt a genuine smile tug at the corners of her lips. She gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Would you like to sit for a moment?" The woman's eyes lit up as she quickly accepted the invitation. For several minutes, they spoke quietly. Naomi shared insights from her career, speaking of resilience and the importance of holding firm in the face of adversity. The conversation was brief, but as the woman rose to return to her seat, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over her. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters carried the deepest meaning. As the plane began its descent, the first officer's voice drifted over the intercom, thanking passengers for their patience during the earlier delay. There was no mention of the incident with Captain Nichols, and Naomi noticed that his voice remained absent throughout the remainder of the flight. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what conversations were unfolding behind the closed door of the cockpit. Moments before landing, Agent Torres leaned across the aisle, lowering her voice so only Naomi could hear. "Nichols has already been flagged for internal review," Torres said quietly. "This won't end here." Naomi nodded thoughtfully. "Good," she said simply. "It shouldn't." The plane touched down smoothly, and as the wheels met the runway, Naomi felt the weight of the morning's events settle into something more manageable. As passengers gathered their belongings, a few nodded respectfully toward Naomi or murmured words of support. She returned their gestures with quiet grace, but didn't linger on them. Stepping off the plane, flanked by Agents Wells and Torres, Naomi felt a familiar resolve take root. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been a necessary one. Every stand taken, every voice raised against injustice, added to the momentum for change. And for Naomi Hayes, that was more than enough reason to keep fighting. Days later, Naomi sat at her desk in her capital city office, overlooking the steady hum of traffic below. Her workspace was meticulously organized, but her thoughts were far from the reports neatly stacked in front of her. The memory of Captain Nichols's baseless accusations lingered. She had faced worse before, but something about his brazen disregard for fairness gnawed at her. Her reflection was interrupted by the soft chime of an email notification. She turned to her laptop and opened the message from Torres. The subject line read, "Follow-up, Nichols Incident." The email subject line read, "Follow-up, Captain Nichols Incident." Naomi Hayes opened it, her eyes scanning the contents with measured focus. The message outlined the results of the airline's internal investigation, driven in part by her formal complaint. The language was clinical, carefully constructed with the precision of corporate legal teams, but the meaning was unmistakable. Captain Nichols had been suspended from duty, pending further disciplinary action. The report detailed how his decisions had violated company policies, noting that his actions were rooted in assumptions rather than facts. His missteps not only jeopardized the airline's reputation, but also put it at risk of legal consequences. Naomi's calm, deliberate response during the incident, backed by the testimony of her colleagues and several passengers, left no room for ambiguity. The facts were clear, and so was the airline's conclusion. The report also acknowledged broader systemic flaws, specifically within the airline's training protocols. It wasn't just about Nichols. The incident had highlighted the urgent need for reform. It was a victory. A small one. For Captain Nichols, the fallout was swift and unavoidable. Days later, he sat alone in a stark conference room, his uniform neatly pressed but suddenly heavy on his shoulders. Across from him sat a panel of airline executives and HR personnel. Their faces were neutral, but their questions held a weight that left little room for evasion. Captain Nichols, the lead investigator, a stern woman with sharp glasses resting at the bridge of her nose, began, "We've reviewed statements from passengers, crew, and Miss Hayes herself. Your decision to flag her as a security risk lacked justification. Can you explain why you acted as you did?" Nichols shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I was trying to ensure the safety of the flight," he replied, his voice defensive but thin. "She refused to comply when I asked her to step off the plane." "Because she had no reason to comply," the investigator cut in, her tone cold. "Your actions appear to have been based on personal bias, not any observable threat. Do you deny that?" Nichols hesitated. His hands gripped the edge of the table. There was nothing to deny. He had no evidence to justify his decisions. No erratic behavior, no suspicious actions. What could he say? That his instincts told him something was off? That the sight of a poised black woman in first class had unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain? "I made a judgment call," he finally said, though even to his own ears the words felt hollow. The investigator's eyes narrowed. "A judgment call that violated multiple company policies, undermined our commitment to inclusivity, and exposed this airline to potential lawsuits," she replied firmly. "This isn't the first complaint we've received about your conduct, Captain Nichols, but it will be the last." Nichols felt his stomach drop. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but there was nothing to say. The decision came swiftly. Captain Nichols was dismissed from his position, effective immediately. In the days that followed, the airline issued a formal apology to Naomi Hayes, accompanied by a public statement acknowledging the incident and outlining corrective measures, mandatory bias training for employees, and a thorough review of security protocols. For Nichols, the loss was personal. His identity, once rooted in the authority of the cockpit, had unraveled. Without his uniform, he was left alone to confront the consequences of his actions and the biases he had long refused to acknowledge. Sitting in his modest apartment, Nichols stared at the termination letter in his hands, the words blurring as his thoughts drifted back to that day on the plane. He had convinced himself he was protecting the flight. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had allowed prejudice to cloud his judgment, and it had cost him everything. When Naomi read the news of Nichols's termination, she felt a quiet mix of emotions. There was satisfaction. Yes, justice had been served, but there was no sense of triumph. She didn't take joy in his downfall. That wasn't the point. What Naomi had always fought for wasn't the punishment of individuals. It was the dismantling of the systems that enabled such behavior to persist. That evening, Naomi sat at her dining table, the glow of city lights flickering through her window. A cup of tea steamed gently in front of her, its warmth grounding her in the stillness of the moment. Her thoughts drifted to the young law student who had approached her on the plane, the quiet passengers who had offered nods of support, and even the flight attendant who had returned with trembling hands to apologize. Each of them was a reminder: this fight was not in vain. Change was slow, often exhausting, but it was possible. And for every Captain Nichols in the world, there were people willing to learn, willing to do better. Naomi took a small sip of tea, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The fight wasn't over. But today, it had moved one step closer to where it needed to be. Captain Nichols eventually found work outside the aviation industry, but the incident followed him like a shadow. Headlines faded, but the quiet whispers from former colleagues and friends lingered, their knowledge of what had happened impossible to shake. For a while, Nichols withdrew from public spaces, avoiding the uncomfortable gaze of those who recognized his name. Yet over time, the weight of what had transpired began to settle differently in his mind. It wasn't just that one incident with Naomi Hayes. As Nichols reflected, he began to see the smaller, more subtle moments throughout his career, times when unchecked bias had shaped his decisions without question. Those moments, seemingly insignificant at the time, now felt larger, more glaring. Years later, in an effort to rebuild not only his professional life but his sense of self, Nichols began volunteering for an organization dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It was a small gesture, but small steps often mark the beginning of growth. For Naomi, the incident became another chapter in her long and ongoing fight for justice, a reminder of how much ground had been gained and how far there was still to go. Standing firm in that airplane cabin had been more than a personal victory. It was a reaffirmation that even the smallest stands can ripple far beyond their moment, shaping the world in ways that aren't always immediately visible. Because in the end, every voice raised, every refusal to back down, every quiet act of defiance brings the world a little closer to the change it so deeply needs. Justice wasn't just achieved for Naomi, it was achieved for everyone who had ever been silently judged. This story isn't just about one flight delay. It's about resilience. It's about the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked high. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that courage makes a difference. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story of truth, hope, and the quiet power of unwavering resolve. Etch.